Oh, oh, everyone's already in the chat already. Everyone's saying hello. Well, I hope you're all doing well. Hello. Whoa. Everyone's already in the chat already. Everyone's saying hello. I didn't realize I had the YouTubes open. Okay, so there we go. I think we're back to normal. Sorry, technical difficulties here at the old CGC broadcast station. As you can see, I am classing it up today with a suit, no less, and that is because I was cold. And we're a classy bunch here at CGC. That's also why. Classy bunch. So, welcome to today's session. As promised, live on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. I woke up this morning and I said, what on earth am I going to talk about? So, I have a presentation for you today, which is something a little bit different. And that presentation is going to be on learning a piece of music. Now, learning a piece of music is, you know, a pretty transformative skill. And many of you out there are very experienced learners, having learned many different things over many different years. Maybe not necessarily classical guitar, but in other guises as well. So maybe some of this information might not be necessarily new, but it could be invigorating to reassess some approaches. And also, you know, I've given this presentation at different places around the world, and I found that people come away thinking, oh yeah, I do need to spend some more time thinking about that and doing that. So maybe that will be the case for you. For all of those in the Academy, I will be chopping this up, as in, you know, chopping the fluff of me chatting right now while people come on in, and making it a nice, concise presentation that hopefully will be useful. So, how you all doing? I'm just going to gas back for another couple of minutes while people come in and let me know how you're doing. I have been, as has Nikki and Dave and James, heavily ensconced in looking at exams. We had 127 exam submissions, and they've been fantastic. It's been such a pleasure. One of my favorite things is to see people improve over previous exams, and I've had several people who I've had the pleasure of looking over their exams who I've seen submit over the years, and it's such a great thing to see that progress. So congratulations everyone, and a big special thanks to Dave, Nikki and James, who put in a ton of work this time around with all of those submissions. I was going back looking at our spreadsheet of all the different submissions over the years, and it has definitely climbed. And of course, with this lockdown, everyone's at home, so there was many more submissions this time around, which is wonderful. They're very, very welcome. What else is going on? I realized when I was talking to Roger, the Roger Ramirez, who's in the chat, everyone say hi to Roger. He is the host of the Classical Guitar Corner Academy Members podcast, the longest title known to Apple podcasts. That's Roger. And I remember figuring out we had 6 out of the last 7 days, or 6 out of 7 days these days, we've been live streaming or teaching groups. We had Nikki and Dave did the left-hand technique workshops on Monday and Wednesday. I streamed the Visée Prelude on Tuesday, streaming now, streaming all day, teaching all day live lessons on Saturday, and then Sunday we have our happy hour. By the way, so I know there's a lot of people from the Academy watching, so the happy hour, this is a totally new thing, but I'm sure many of you have Zoom called or Skype called some friends during this time, just to check in and say hello. It's really very nice to just see people, and Evita and I have done it with dance friends and guitar friends, just saying hello. We'll often have a glass of wine or a beer and just chat, and even though it's not the same as being there in person, it's pretty good. So we're going to try and replicate that in the happy hour session we're going to have on Sunday. It's going to be 4 p.m. This is just for the Academy. This is not public, because who knows what would happen if we opened up to public. Many strange things are possible. but it's just for the Academy. We're gonna, as a funny thing, we're gonna try and have a kind of open mic session, relaxed, fun, but no classical guitar. That is the thing we're gonna change. So that'll be an opportunity for some people to sing some songs, tell some jokes, read some poems, share some paintings. I'm looking at you, Drew. I know the Roger Ramirez. It's going to be now, from now on, it'll be capital T-H-E, Roger Ramirez. I know he plays piano, so I'm expecting some great... Martha asked, can we play pool at the happy hour? We can try. We can try to do something weird with our computers. Maybe we can... Or maybe we can try and recreate the Brady Bunch picture with all the little boxes. So yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. Well, everyone's coming on in. So this is going to be a little different. I'm actually going to do a keynote presentation. This is from, obviously it's a Austin Powers thing, but Ben Verdery always did that in lessons. Whenever we came across something that was... You know, we made a little discovery or did something that worked, we would like, oh, so like if you know, use your third finger and suddenly it makes it easier. So Ben and I will often come across that little movement there. So Roger saying it's just going to be an hour of banjo on Sunday, pretty much. Kerry Conroy, hello Kerry. And you are going to be sneakily featured at the end of this presentation. You may not know it now, but you will be. You will be featured. Your work will be featured in this presentation. So I hope that's okay. Alrighty, that should be about enough gas bagging. 4:07. Shall we get into it? I wish there was no lag. I think there is an option to do these with no lag, but who knows what would happen. So I'll have to wait 30 seconds for everyone to go, yeah, let's do it. So I am going to talk about learning a piece of music. So at the Classical Guitar Corner Academy, we do have a particular approach to learning, and it's very structured. I teach in a structured way because in the early stages of my musical development, I didn't have structure. The first time I really came across structured education was with my great teacher, Rafael Agostino. And he was one to give me some structure in my learning, but also remove a lot of things from my plate at the time because, as many of you might sympathize, there is sometimes we can have shiny object syndrome where we get attracted to all these different pieces and can actually take away from our learning process. So he was a great gift to me as a learner in my learning experience. And that was when I started to really understand how powerful a structured approach to learning could be. Also, I grew up in Australia and I did some grades with the AMEB, the Australian Music Education Board. That is an approach to learning that splits up partitions, pieces, harmony, theory, musicianship, and technique. There's theory, technique, and repertoire into grades. So we get preliminary, then grade 1 through 8, and then we have a associate certificate. They've all changed it all now, but associate certificate, licentiate, etc. And so it really was great at setting goals and reaching new levels. And you can obviously see the direct translation I've done from that kind of system into the academy because I believe in it. It really worked for me, and I think it works for a lot of other people. It's not for everybody. Not everyone wants to do exams. Not everyone wants to be dictated by sort of a list of pieces. But for those who it does work for, I think it's very powerful. So that's on a grand scale. But if we take the approach of learning a piece on sort of a more microcosm, then we can also do similar things where we are structured in how we approach a single piece of music. And I've done this in a microcosm level, both in the lessons inside the academy, but very explicitly in the study guides that I've created. I created a study guide for the Prelude by Visée, which we looked at last live stream. Lágrima, Allegro by Giuliani. And I've been creating more for the academy as well. But if you've ever seen any of those, you can see I really break down the components so that we work through it thoroughly. As many of you might have experienced in learning, you can kind of fast track your way in because you love a piece, and then 6 months later you actually go back and find all the gaps and have to fill those in, and that can not necessarily be the best way to learn. So let's dive in. I hope everyone's ready. All right, here we go. This is my first time doing this. So say goodbye to my face forever. Screen share. Yep. Oh great, I can still see comments and things. I'm going to ask, just so I don't mess this up, can everyone see the first slide, and can everyone still hear me? That's going to be my question, because I just don't want to mess this up because I haven't done it before. I assume it should be fine, but just give me a thumbs up, or as many people have been doing, washing hands emoji. That would be very helpful. Yes, I get a yes. Great. Okay, well, James, I appreciate that yes. That was the first one to come in, so I'm going to take it and run with it. All right, so this presentation is on a structured approach to practice, specifically for learning repertoire. This presentation is going to be about developing a learning process for classical guitar repertoire. We're going to look at why developing your own learning process might be useful, what components go in to learning a piece of music, how you might create your own system to learn a piece of music, and finally, the secret to making it work. That's just to intrigue you to stay with me all the way to the end. But no, it is definitely a secret. So that's what we're going to have a look at. All right. So why might developing your own learning process be useful? As we go through these questions, I'd like you to think about them for yourself and try and answer them. If we were together in a live setting, then maybe I'd be asking some people in the audience. But I do have a think when I come across these questions. So why might it be useful to learn a process, to develop a process to learn repertoire? Number one, it's going to save you time. So don't wait for someone else to point out something in the score, and mistakes take a long time to undo. So what do I mean there? I have come across many times where someone would be in a masterclass setting, or perhaps in just simply a lesson. And half of the time, if not more, is spent with the teacher just simply pointing things out in the score, saying, oh, well, actually, that's either a note, maybe a note might be a G that's supposed to be a G sharp, or maybe there's a dynamic that's missing, or there's an articulation that's missing, perhaps, or a rhythm that's been misread. So that kind of information doesn't need to be reiterated as much as it really is in lessons. It can be worked on earlier if you've got an approach, a structured approach to learning. And of course, those mistakes that you do come across with that G natural that crept in, or the rhythm that was incorrect, yes, you might have it pointed out by a teacher, but it takes a very long time to undo. And the reason is that we lay neural pathways in the brain, and through repetition, those pathways get reinforced. So not only do you have to undo that previous pathway, but you have to lay a new one as well. So it's much more work to change habits than it is to start a new one. And of course, habits is going to be playing correctly. Number two, consistency, memorization, and accuracy. Essentially, the body knows whatever you repeat. So if you're repeating that G natural 100 times, 1,000 times, who knows how many times we repeat these passages in music, then your body's going to know that's what it repeats, therefore that's what it's going to be repeating in the future again. So yes, repetition of scales and things is very important, but it's what kind of repetition, how are you repeating those scales? That is really the name of the game here. One of the things I talk about in scale practice is that we don't want to mindlessly run over scales. Rather, we want to be very mindful, because carefully said, you could be practicing, but you could actually be practicing bad habits and reinforcing bad habits. Third, avoiding shiny objects leads to mastery. So staying focused in a distracting world is going to be a huge asset. Focused attention results in improvement, and improvement fuels motivation. So I think it's a very virtuous cycle. That's something that we've found has been very powerful at the Academy here at Classical Guitar Corner, is that although it might be infuriating to spend 6 months on the Minuet by Petzold, but it does result in pushing you to focus, to improve, and that improvement is ultimately what will fuel motivation to continue and put in extra effort. All right. So what components are going to be involved in learning a piece? This is a question I'd like you to start thinking about now. What goes into learning a piece? Think about all the different things when you take a fresh score and you're going to have to learn it. What goes into that? So see if you can think about that and think about some of the different aspects that come into it. I mean, there's a lot of them, very obvious ones, but maybe you could even pause this and then come back to it. But here we go. Let's go through a list. Okay, we've got a key signature. We've got the form. We've got dynamic markings, expressive markings, phrasing, voices, fingering both left and right hand. We've got ornaments, analysis, style and interpretation. All of these things are going to go into the learning process, and there are aspects of the music that we need to think about at some point. So we may as well do it earlier rather than later. So, just given this, I wonder if any of you can identify, are any of these either left out in your learning process, or are they somewhat glossed over, or perhaps they're only addressed later on? One of the questions that I do get often, and I often reference John Williams, who is such a inspiration for so many of us, is, at what point do we start thinking about music? And in the conversation I had with him on our podcast, he said, no question, you have to start thinking about music from the very, very beginning. So many of us might think about technique and fingering and ornaments and things, and then eventually come back to phrasing and interpretation. But if we take this idea of the body knows what it repeats, if you're for 6 months playing a piece with a mechanical mindset and then try and put musicality into it, you're going to be fighting against your muscle memory because you've repeated it a certain way so many times. All right, so we're going to be playing through 3 different example pieces, and these are the pieces that I've written study guides for. So I'm going to take a break from talking and actually play through these, both to give my voice a rest and also just to remind us of what these pieces sound like. Perhaps you're not familiar with all of them. Here we go. This is Lágrima. I'm going to play this through just a quick rough outline without repeats. So that is the very popular Prelude Lágrima by Francisco Tárrega. That's our first piece. The next piece might be very familiar to those who've been watching some of these presentations, the Prelude from Suite in D minor by Robert de Visée. And then our third example is going to be from Le Papillon, the Butterfly by Mauro Giuliani. It's Allegro. There they are. These are the pieces we will be using as our example pieces to break down into components. So let's tackle some of these sections that we laid out before in terms of the components. Okay, key and form. Now, we played through Lágrima just earlier, and many of you are very familiar with this piece. So the benefits of just simply, maybe some of these aspects are going to be very quick for you. They're going to be simply identifying certain, let's say, geographic aspects. Where are the repeats? What's the key signature? What key centers are we in? Do we change key centers? And then, just doing that checklist will really elucidate certain concepts. And again, it's the kind of thing that will save you 6 months of playing the wrong note. Just by going in and saying, okay, there's a D sharp in this key signature, therefore there are going to be D sharps in the piece, etc. And here that we have an F sharp here and it changes key. We've got E minor down here, and so there's no more C sharp, G sharp, or D sharp implicit in the key signature. Very simple things like that, which are no-brainers, that you probably know. It's not something you have to learn so much as just go through the process, just to make sure we don't miss any of those small details. So key, we start out in E major here in Lágrima. That key of E major. And then the second half of the piece, the B section, is in E minor, which we call a parallel minor. So it's the same root note of E, but it's the minor instead of the major. And in fact, those key centers outline the form for us. So we have the first section we might call A, and then we've got this second section we might call B. And then we have the repeat of the A section, and the repeat of the B section, and we have this DC al fine, which is dal capo al fine, which means go back to the head, the top, and finish at fine. Easy enough. Now, I think learning a solo piece, this would be somewhat done through osmosis, but having just a little bit of a system, this is going to be great if you come across ensemble pieces that you have to play rather quickly, just getting lay of the land, marking out the key centers, marking out the form. If we want to go a little bit further, we can actually explore those key centers and really think about the notes we'll be using. So just like playing, just finding all those notes in the key. That was an E major scale there, just finding out where we might be playing them. That's the kind of thing that, like I was talking about, missing one of those notes and making that mistake early on. This is the kind of thing that, even though it seems almost redundant, it's going to save us time in the long run, because we're going to discover those little things that sometimes slip through the cracks. And then similarly, playing the harmonic scale as well. Relatively straightforward stuff, I think. Now, analysis. Analysis is something that I think scares a lot of people. It's a term that might make you think, oh, I'm not advanced enough as a musician to do this, or that's only for academics, or what have you. I like to think of analysis as any way that you can further your understanding of a piece of music, full stop. If that analysis is just what we did in that previous section and said, okay, there's two sections, or there's a key signature change here. I don't know what key that means, but it changes. Or I see it starts with an E and ends with an E. Anything like that, that is analysis in my book. Of course, we can get very far down the rabbit hole with analysis, but every little bit counts, and every little bit helps you understand and comprehend the piece. So don't be afraid of this term, and be confident with the fact that you can analyze a piece even with the most rudimentary knowledge of music. I think we can start identifying important aspects of the music. So let's take a couple of examples. We had the Allegro, the Giuliani Allegro, and that piece was largely based on arpeggios. Right? And what can happen is that often these pieces, especially I would say music by Giuliani, Carcassi, Carulli, these arpeggios are often outlining a chord. So if we can somehow take those notes, which is what I've done here in one of these study guides, and actually break that down and just say, oh, that's an A minor right there. And then, oh, the second chord, that's actually just a D minor chord. And then the last one is an E major chord. And then, you know, if we have the skills to do, this is little Roman numeral analysis, and say, well, in A minor, that's 1, 4, 5. And many of you might know that that chord progression, that series of chords, is the genetic makeup of many folk and pop songs. We wouldn't be blessed with so much great music if we didn't have this progression. So there's a bit of analysis there. What we're doing is we're stacking those chords, we're taking it from arpeggios and putting them into block chords. You know, another, like a more complex example might be, let's say, Barrios' La Catedral. And just going, okay, there's that chord. Or this. From the Bach Fugue, we could just go, oh, guitar's going out of tune. But, you know, just identifying those chords. And what happens is instead of having an entire measure of 16th notes, we suddenly get one harmony. And that simplifies it for us. That helps us understand and comprehend what's going on in the music. So we can just think A minor with an arpeggio, D minor with an arpeggio, and E with an arpeggio. Now, if we were to take that entire piece, we can see that this is what the whole piece, that whole Giuliani Allegro piece, with all those arpeggios that we saw, looks like if we just stack the chords. Let me just check my tuning for a second. There's the culprit. There's another culprit. So it's something like this, right? This is on the first chord. Now we're on the second chord. Now we're on the third chord. This is the E major chord with the sharp there. And then here we have an A minor. Now if I were to play through the chords, you can see it really helps it break down. And this is on the simpler side of an example, but you can imagine how this could be very, very useful in many situations. So taking those arpeggiations, which are so common in classical guitar music, and just creating block chords. Let's take something perhaps a little more detailed now. Now this is the prelude that we looked at with the Visée prelude. And you can see what I've done here. I like, as many people who've worked with me know, I like to call it arts and crafts time. I'll actually use highlighters. And in the fancy computer programs, I've just colored the note head. So this is the equivalent of highlighting this with a green highlighter. And then what I've done is highlight little lines that I want to bring out, or I've identified. Again, this is analysis, and we're saying, look, I can see there's a descending scale line here. This is the green notes. Great, and so I want to bring that out. Now I've identified it, so I'll bring it out with a thumb. And wouldn't that, even just that, be such a gift to identify early on in your learning process instead of waiting 6 months for someone else to teach you or show you. Similarly, we can find other descending lines. Here's another one. Oh, that's actually very similar to the one we came before. That's interesting. And another green one up here. Oh, that's interesting too. So all these lines, and we can make different things of it if we like, but we're just identifying things. Now what's happening with this, this blue here? see this is part of these. I've phrased these together, and this is a little grouping. So I've gone da, 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 and then the next grouping is da, 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 da. Then another grouping. So I've identified little phrase ideas here. We're actually part of a sequence. Oh, there's that sequence, and I've even gone to the length of mapping out the harmonies, because I could do that. If you can't map out the harmonies, that's fine. So, and then we can see that I'm accumulating all this different analysis. I'm saying here's a section that's similar, and then a contrasting section, etc. So that's a bit more of a detailed analysis where we're talking about voices. Let's move on to dynamics and expression now. This is something that, like I said, maybe we start to think about this much later in the game. But thinking about it early on is a really valuable thing to do. So here we have the Giuliani Allegro piece that we looked at with the blocked chords. And now I've gone through and we've got some dynamic markings here. Now, dynamics are often your chance to be expressive and creative as a musician. It's your chance to have ideas with the music and to experiment. They don't have to be steadfast. Many different ideas work. But here we're starting mezzo forte. And I've chosen to do this, what we call a hairpin crescendo here, where we go up and then down in dynamic. We do another one over here. We're basically following the contour of these notes with dynamics. And then here, a little poco ritardando, so slowing down there. And then look, I've decided on the second one to do some articulation. I've started soft. So all of these ideas are ideas I'm having earlier on in the learning process. I'm not waiting weeks, months, years until someone suggests it to me. I'm going through a process of experimentation and creativity so that I can make this more expressive from the very beginning. So this is an element we can bring into our learning process as well. Phrasing. Now this is incredibly important. Phrasing is something where we understand how notes connect to one another, how things interact, and really, understanding context. So here we are back at the prelude, and what you can see I've done here is this is called exploding a score, because this is music that has voices in it, and these voices are somewhat disguised in classical guitar music. They're squashed together. So if we were to explode these out, this is what you would see. You would hear this top voice here, stop down here. And if we started here, we hear this lower voice. We really start to hear music in a different light. We start to hear it in its different parts. And I've often recommended to students that you play different parts independently. Sometimes it's easier. Two parts there, one upper and one lower. But here you can see that there's actually three voices, and the middle one is much more obscured, let's say. It's sort of a little more, you need to be a bit of a detective sometimes to find these voices. And that's why, those who've worked with me can put their hands up and say, yes, I've had the experience in a lesson where the teacher has said, oh, but do you know that this is part of a voice? Like, for instance, this voice here. These voices are connected. I mean, very, very rarely would our ear be attracted to that if we were just playing through the music as written. So taking some time to understand the voices, and then also we've added these phrases. We've talked about once we can identify the phrases, the voices, we can understand how the notes relate to each other more clearly. Similarly here in Lágrima, we've got different examples of phrasing. This is called sentential structure. This is outlined in the Academy, but we've got basically one idea, and then here we have pretty much an identical repetition, only differentiated by dynamic here, and then the B section. And that's a longer answering idea. And similar sentential structure here. And the real virtue of understanding this is it really helps us conceive of the music, how it relates, how phrases relate to one another, and what notes belong together as ideas, as opposed to somewhat blindly letting our fingers make decisions early on. All right, voices. I talked a little bit about this with the Prelude, but voices, you know, some of us might raise an eyebrow at that term. Sometimes people think of it as lines, musical lines, but I like to think of it as voices, as if we were in part of a choir, and you've got the bass, and maybe above that you've got the tenor, and then above that you've got the alto, and then soaring up above we've got the soprano. And although in the guitar world we often think of those as block chords, we want to start thinking horizontally that how those notes relate to each other as a single line, as a single voice. So in the Giuliani Allegro, yes, we have all those arpeggios, but we have a bass voice that really is very active, and there's a line there. Right? And that voice is going to help us make all of these musical decisions, it's going to help us shape the music, guide our musical decisions along the way. So identifying that's going to be really helpful and pretty straightforward in that piece too. Now here's an example of where voices are actually much more challenging to discern. This is the middle voice of Lágrima. So we've got the top voice with the stems going up. Quite obvious. The bass voice is quite obvious too. But the middle voice is something that, as a teacher, I'm often asking people to be a little bit softer with, to pull back with, and it's unless you understand what we're actually talking about, it's hard to control that. I think the B's are quite obvious, right? Because they're quite repetitive. Because what often happens in this piece is the B's are as loud as the melody. So the melody sounds like it's this. Right? But we want to pull it back in the texture so we have a three-dimensional or three-layered set of dynamics. So melody, most prominent, bass, second most prominent, and then this orange voice being far less prominent. And suddenly the music has depth. Now, where the time taken to analyze this piece a little bit is invaluable is understanding that this extra material here is part of that voice too, and down here, and here. Look at all this other orange stuff other than just these repeated B's. And that really lets you decide early on, not 6 months later, how to play this music and start those good habits from the beginning. So we've got notes like this, this G sharp here, that get caught up in left-hand transitions, more difficult moments. Those are the kind of notes that we sometimes accent because we haven't thought about it. We just let the fingers do what they do, which is, because it's just before a shift, so we tend to accent that note. All of those kind of things, it's great to spend some time, have a process of learning a piece of music, understanding this before we get started. So, voices, I think I've already gone over this really. Yes, I talked about the exploding of the voices, so I think this is a bit redundant. Maybe I got there, I was too eager to talk about the voices, but you can see, particularly, here at the end where it gets a bit more dense, if I play this line here from the bottom, maybe choose a voice. You can choose the soprano voice, you can choose the middle tenor voice, or you can choose the bass voice here. Pick a voice, maybe not the top voice because that's the most obvious, and try and hone in on it with your ears as I play here from measure 7 to the end. Right? And so it suddenly becomes a little less vertical in the way you think about this music and much more horizontal. We're going over time of these voices. And there's a lot of beauty in there as well, I think. Okay. Ornaments. Now, ornaments are interesting. Really good advice, in my opinion, is that you might learn parts of music without playing the ornaments first. So this will allow you to play the musical line undisturbed by technical difficulty because ornaments are quite virtuosic in my opinion. They're very fast when you think about it. Right? There's a lot of speed and articulation and accuracy going on there. And so to try and do that while learning a musical line or identifying a musical line is going to really get in the way of your understanding. So my first thought is to take these out when you can, and you can always add them back in later. Also, I like to think as ornaments as literally ornamenting a musical line. So it's not the main focus. But let's say, well, let's just take an example from here. Sorry, it must be heating up in here. The guitar's going out of tune. All right, so the line here, I'm looking at the top of the page at 8. That's the musical line. Da, 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 da. So we don't want to do this and go the F and that ornament is not the focus of what we're doing. Rather, it's just embellishing it. So it's important to have a clear concept of that musical line first. And then, should we want to work on the ornament itself, very rarely would I suggest just hammering it over the head in the music itself. Rather, create some exercises. So here in a little exercise. So there I'm working on my first finger ornament there. And of course, one of the other challenges is the fact you have to have your first finger down. So down here we have an exercise. We're taking the difficulty out of a musical context and just working on it. So that's something, again, you could be structured about and plan out in your practice, as opposed to just bulldozing through the music and finding a difficult spot and just sort of using brute force to overcome it. Similarly, here we have trills, same concept, just a very different ornament, a different moment. You can see examples of how we might take that out of the music and make an exercise out of it. So, with all of that, we haven't really, we might have the guitar in hand for some of this, but we really haven't been working on the music per se. So, what is it, do you think, that might get in the way of all of this? Something I think that we launch and grab onto very early on could somehow get in the way of all of this, and that is fingering. Now, the reason I say that is that often we will gravitate to the most obvious, accessible fingering that we can get. It also might be just the fingering that we find on the page. There are typos that exist in the world. Oh my gosh, do I know about typos? There are choices that do not suit your hand in the world. There are choices that are objectively bad choices as well. So fingering is something, think about all of those things that we learned. We learned about the phrasing, we learned about the lines, we thought about ornaments, we thought about block chords and harmony. With that knowledge, isn't that a better place to now start laying habitual neuron connections in the brain from the get-go with all of that in mind? I think so. I know it asks for discipline, but I think it's worth it in the long run, because we do spend such extraordinary amounts of time with these pieces of repertoire when you think about it. Okay, so here, for instance, this is an example of fingering that you might want to do that wouldn't normally be prescribed. So we have... Okay, so here I'm using my third finger on the E and the second finger on the G sharp. I have to play through to realize why. Oh, I know why. So it's because this A up here is played with the second finger, and then you can use a guide finger to go down to the G sharp instead of jumping. Now, this is a little bit of, it's going to work for some people, not for other people. But my point is, and this is the whole reason, it's the concept of this, is that this is going to be a better choice for some people. Because it's got a really nice, you can just shift the second finger from that A to the G sharp on the third string, no lifting, no hopping, no nothing. Similarly, down here we have an equally unusual choice here to go 2-4 instead of 1, using second finger on the G sharp there. Now, if you didn't spend time understanding certain aspects about the voices or connection or what have you, then you're not going to experiment with these earlier on, and you're going to spend a lot of time embedding fingering that's either prescribed or just not really thought about until maybe it's not too late, obviously, but it just takes time to undo. So I really think going into fingering with an opinion and understanding, comprehension of the music was going to be a really good practice. Also, understanding, here, this is a great example of the kind of fingering that if you take the time to understand what's going on, it's going to actually save you a lot of time, and it's much easier. So for instance, oops, sorry, I have to go back one now. Yes, here we go. So this G sharp with the guide finger, 4, 4, 4, 4. If we do that, it's just quite easy. It keeps our contact with the string, and it really helps our shifting because it gives us tactile guidance. But often I'll come across people who play, they'll lift, 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 right? They'll lift every single time because they didn't realize that you can actually keep it as a guide finger in contact with that string the whole time. Get a little bit of lovely, a little bit of glissando there, maybe if you want, which is very stylistic too. Similarly, we might choose a different fingering here because of we could go 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, all up here. We could do that, it would work, but you get a bit of string noise. So perhaps in an effort to remove that, we could go, we actually use different fingers, and it helps with string noise. All of these things are relatively discoverable for you. It's about spending a little bit of time thinking about it. None of this is particularly revelationary. It's not. It just takes a little bit of discipline, and I think the structured approach helps with that. Helps to think about this. Go, okay, now I'm going to look at the fingering after I've gone through all of these musical things because I know that this is part of the same voice, etc. I think lastly in fingering, I believe this is the last slide to do with fingering, we have barres. Now, this barre symbol here is saying bar at the 9th fret. But what it doesn't say, and what I've changed in my own publication style, is how many strings need to be barred there. And in fact, it's only 3, I believe. Oh no, it's 4, because we use it here. So I just did the discovery then. But hands up at home if you have ever used 6 strings for a barre when you only actually needed 2 or 3. Many of us, right? So it's worth spending a little bit of time to discover, oh, I only need a certain amount of strings in a barre, and for only a certain duration of time as well. We all know barres are tiring on the left hand and they're downright difficult. So it's worth using them as seldom as possible and as minimally as possible. All right, so inevitably we're going to come across parts in the music that are difficult, either technical challenges and places to do drill spots. So what can we do there? Well, in our practice, our structured approach to practice, we can take those moments, like I said before with the ornaments, and we can create exercises out of them. If we're working on something, like the Visée, which has a lot of finger independence, here we've got an exercise which I came up with. So I wonder what that would be working on. Well, what am I talking about? It's written there in the title. That's the finger independence aspect. It's an exercise I came up with, and this is not rocket science. You can come up with it too. That I'm asking, in this case, I'm asking the bass notes to be held down while the top voice moves, and here I'm asking for the treble notes to be held while the bass notes move. Similarly, here I've come up with an exercise that works on these particular trills, slurs, control and rhythm for these slurs. So a really nice way to work on moments that are difficult is not necessarily to hammer away at it through brute force of just trying to get it right in the music, but rather create an exercise out of it and then come back to the music with your technique enhanced. Okay, we are going to look at maybe making your own process. I mean, honestly, all of these aspects can be jumbled up into different ways that suit your learning style and your work style. Maybe some things maybe you don't need to work on. Maybe some things you find come somewhat naturally. Maybe some things will be very beneficial to add in just as a matter of process. So I want to just look at, this is one example from our very I'm so lost for words. This person is so fantastic. This is Kerry in the CGC Academy, and this is just one way. It's not even really tapping into what we've been talking about so much as just a way to structure your approach, to think about, I'm going to work on this at this point in time, right? So here we have what I was talking about in terms of arts and crafts time, just using broad color strokes to say, oh, I'm going to work on this patch of music, and then maybe identifying musical lines, maybe you're identifying things to practice, really broad strokes. And it really is, I love arts and crafts time because it takes something that might seem intimidating, very high level analysis, and just, identifying things, deciding on things to work on. And then maybe you might write it down on a piece of paper. It doesn't need to be a fancy spreadsheet template. You can just identify things, breakdown by analysis, upper voice, lower voice, different difficult movement isolations, left hand practice, etc. This is just an excellent approach. It's worked for this person phenomenally well, and I like to show this because it's just handwritten on a piece of paper. There's nothing getting in your way. I think writing it down is helpful because just trying to do it off the top of your head, you'll forget about things. And then there's even a timeline here of working on things. So, really impressive, Kerry. Okay, so after all of that, all of those ingredients to bake a cake and things that might inspire you, what is really the secret to making all of this work? It's not perhaps what you think. It's not a drill or buying a more expensive guitar or a certain type of string. Rather, I believe that the ways to build a positive habit, achieve goals, and make progress come down to this. It really is about joy, in my opinion. Joy, the enjoyment of what you're doing. It's about having something to work towards. It's about having something that gives you a sense of achievement. It's about holding yourself accountable, having other people hold yourself accountable. So let's go through these things. So attending a festival or a summer school, this gives you something on the horizon, a place and time that you got to work towards. Performance goals, masterclasses, open mics, anything where, or you're just recording yourself and saying, I'm going to do this. Exams, we just had 130 odd, not 130, 120 odd exams submitted at the Academy, and this serves the purpose for many of these people, that there's a window of time that you can take the exam and submit it, and then you get your response. And some people have asked us, why can't we make this evergreen? Can the exams be open all year? Well, we lose this a little bit. We lose that moment in time where there's accountability, there's some time pressure, and then there's some peer momentum from all your colleagues. That's why we do it twice a year, and we have a wonderful result. You can write down your goals and a date to achieve it. You don't need to do an exam. You can just set your own deadlines and goals. You can play in an ensemble. Oh my gosh, tick, 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 right? Playing in an ensemble, and I'm sure we will all be able to play ensembles again in the future. Playing in an ensemble is going to give you accountability because other people are relying on you. Playing in an ensemble is going to sweep you along with energy of a wave because people are learning and moving as well. So maybe you'll be pushed. Maybe you'll be a little uncomfortable sometimes, but that's good. It's gonna hold you accountable for rhythmic things. It's gonna be such a great learning curve. So that's a big one in my opinion, one of the best. Attending Guitar Society events, very similar to a festival, but much on a more regular and local. And then anything you can do to hold yourself accountable. Even if you tell your dog, look, you better be on the couch at 7 because I'm gonna play through Lágrima. Really anything that works for you. But this is the secret sauce that will get you going through a structured approach to learning, because the structured approach is going to help you achieve these goals, arrive at these moments. And while it might seem like hard work, the joy that you receive out of attending something, turning up for something, for even failing at something, that you gave it a shot, you worked towards something, you made improvements, all of that will fuel this process moving forward. Okay, so we looked at a structured approach to practicing, why a process could help you improve your practice, what components go in to learning a piece of music. We went through a lot of that. How you might create your own system. There's many different ways to make this work, and I think many of you, because for the large part, I assume that we're all adults here. I don't think we really work with too many kids, so we know how to learn. We just need to create that learning process. And of course, the secret to making it work is really joy, finding the way to bring joy into that process that will fuel that work to move it forward, whether it be playing with your kids, whether it be playing with your spouse, whether it be playing for other people, whether it be setting a goal and achieving it, recording yourself, or any of the above. What you know yourself obviously better than I do, so whatever works for you to bring joy into this process, which creates a virtuous cycle of that joy fuels your motivation to do that kind of diligent practice moving forward. So that's it. That's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you come away with a few ideas to shape your own practice. I hope maybe it's inspired you to think differently about your practice approach, and it might help transform the way you work. So, I'm back. That was it was challenging to talk to the screen like that because I didn't get to see you all, but hopefully that was interesting, and maybe it gave you some thoughts. Now, I did see a lot of questions coming in, and I didn't really get to address them because I wanted to go straight through, because I will be editing this and putting it in the Academy for anyone that wants to see it in the Academy. Would anyone who had questions mind writing them again. It's a little tricky sometimes to go back through the comments to find them. So if you could maybe write them again, I will see them. I will take a little sip of coffee. Thank you very much for the nice words. I really appreciate that. So yeah, if you want to write any questions or you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about. I think there's a lot to question in this. I think this is my approach. It works for me. It works for a lot of the people at the Academy. I've always said, and I always say to Dave and Nikki, you know, what we do, I think, is excellent for people that it works for. And for other people, it's not for them. And we often will say, you know, this is not the right fit. That's the words we use. It's like, not a good fit for this. They're not a good fit for us, or we're not a good fit for them, because everyone learns differently. Everyone teaches differently. And it's really about finding that blend that suits you. So this is a relatively opinionated way of learning. As I said, it's come from my experience. And maybe you can mold it to make it work for you. Okay, so let's see if some questions have come in. Thank you everyone for your kind words. I appreciate it very much. I'm not sure if this is a question, but self-compassion, an important component of practice. Let me just put those. Self-compassion, an important component of practice. Absolutely. I can't tell you how many people are incredibly hard on themselves in this process. And I think there's a great deal of courage and bravery, and there's no hyperbole there, in people who have been extremely good in their field. Honestly, in the Academy, we've got literally rocket scientists, we've got surgeons, lawyers, accountants, experienced teachers, professors, parents, amazing parents, you know, like all these people who excel at something in their life because they've probably been doing it for a couple of decades, if not more. And then they are willing and open to not only becoming a beginner again, but also embracing it and sharing it with other people and taking those beginner steps in front of people. I think that takes an incredible amount of bravery that not everyone has, in my opinion. And what can happen in that process is we get so down on ourselves, so hard on ourselves about mistakes or not being the best or good at whatever. But it is important to be compassionate, to give yourself a break, and even especially in these times right now when we're all locked down. You know, be kind to yourself, be kind to others. But in this process of learning music, celebrating successes is great. Honing in on the positive is fantastic. And yes, we address things when they need moving forward, and we can be critical, but we can embrace them with a sense of adventure and challenge rather than thinking that it's something to do with us as a person. It's not a reflection on us as a person. We're on this journey. So Jacques, hi Jacques. The neural pathways, don't we just create new ones instead of erasing the bad ones? Well, I am not well read enough about myelin and these neural pathways. Yes, we are creating new ones, but the thing is, I definitely can say with surety that let's say if we want to change technique, we are very much in a battle with our prior muscle memory. So that's what I mean by the erasing the other neural connections. You know, we've got a repetition that has instilled in us a certain way of moving, whether it be a concave wrist if you come from steel string playing or electric guitar playing, or maybe a collapsed right hand because you've come from some other style. That is going to be fighting against us for a while as we perhaps try and establish a good classical technique. And in a microcosm, the same thing happens when we learn a wrong note for 6 months and then start trying to play the correct one. The wrong note keeps wanting to come back into the music because we've repeated it so many times. That's my take on it. Oh, Drew, that's a pretty profound question. How does failure help us grow as musicians? Well, in one small context, I think there's many different ways we could talk about that. But I think failure is, in many ways, to be strived for and celebrated. And I think it is in some other realms. You know, in sort of the technology world and startups and things like that, as I understand, failing quickly is a goal, because it means you're trying things, you're trying out ideas and being creative. And of course, it's not always going to work. Your ideas will not always work. Many of them don't. So failing quickly will get you through this. Now that's a little bit of a different world, but let me take in a musical context. We could think of failure, depends what you call failure, I suppose, but taking risks. Think about someone up on stage that goes for it in a piece of music. Maybe it falls to pieces, but there's a couple of moments in there that they're like really forte or really intense, and there's a couple of things. And going for it and taking that risk, yes, maybe the music won't work the way you want at that time, but over time, with those risks, you will get the kind of performing that you probably admire in other people, and that's very characterful and robust and exciting. You know, you only get there if you take those risks. And you know, another take on that as well with failure. Oh, my voice is giving out. But another take on that is that I like to think when we start identifying things in our playing that need work, we like, that's not good. Oh, I'm really hearing that tone isn't good enough now, or it's too harsh or whatever. That reflects a change in us. And I think instead of saying I've identified something wrong, it actually means my ears have opened up to understand. You need to be able to hear bad tone first before you can improve. So it's a positive thing if you start finding faults in your playing, so to speak, or identifying failures. That's an opportunity there to move forward. I think it's a really positive thing if you start hearing. You know, some people think that they go backwards sometimes, but I think what's really happening is you're hearing yourself differently. So Stephen Holland asked a question, which was addressed earlier, but I did see it whiz by on the questions as I was talking, and you know, it was talking about, because we had in Lágrima, we had the middle voice was the softer one, and he asked, is it always? And no is the answer to that. And how do we decide then what is? Well, exactly through that process. We go through the music and we analyze it to the best of our ability. And we say, oh, here's the melody, here's the bass. And sometimes in the middle, we have a musical line. And that's when we bring it out, because we've said, oh, nothing else is happening, but in the middle voice, something's happening. And that's when we might bring that out. So it really is, we can't assume any particular rules about melody is always 1, bass is always 2, and accompaniment is always 3 in terms of priority. It often is, but going through that structured approach will help us understand and make those decisions earlier on. Oh, difficult question. Elias, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, asked, I sometimes get kind of frustrated when I can't overcome technical difficulties. Sometimes I end up not enjoying playing a piece. How can I recover the joy I had? Well, there are times when we do need to look at ourselves and understand, are we asking realistic goals of ourselves? Have we taken on a piece perhaps that's too difficult, that's a bit out of our reach? There are virtues to taking on pieces that are out of our reach, but what we're looking for is something called the zone of proximal learning, which is taking material that here's our abilities, here's everything else, and then we want to be working on something that operates about here. So just extending our skill sets just past the point of confidence into that area that's called zone of proximal ability or learning. But it's the same, the concept's the same. And that's ideally what we want. And that's what teachers can ideally do for you. That's where they know you're playing and they say, okay, this piece is going to be great for you because X. We try and do that with the academy, the way that curriculum is structured, that it's kind of inbuilt in the academy. But my suggestion is sometimes you need to say, and I'm going to have a break from this piece. Maybe if you can identify the technique that's giving you trouble, maybe you can find an easier piece that works on that technique on a sort of less intense way. So that will keep you going in the right direction, but give you more enjoyment. And sometimes you just want to, change things up. Maybe you can, Stephanie Jones was on the podcast, this live thing last week. She talked about playing saxophone and jazz guitar and how those really brought so much into her classical guitar playing over a long period of time. So you can sort of acknowledge a stopping point and say, actually I'm going to put my attention onto I'm going to listen now and listen to music aloud, or do some other style, or do some other exercises. You can you don't have to keep trying to go through the wall. You can maybe think somewhat like your own therapist. It's like, well, what will bring you joy now? What would sort of get you around this if really this is just making you frustrated? Okay. Okay, I'm not sure how too many questions I can go with, but I'll take a few more. These are kind of pretty deep questions. Sometimes we are just learning pieces because they are basically milestones rather than the pieces we enjoy. For pieces like this, when is good enough so we can move on? Yeah, it's a fine line. I come across this question a lot. Some pieces are intended to focus on something, like a study might be focusing on one particular technical or musical aspect. And do we always have to bring them up to performance level? No, we can use them as a vehicle to bring us to a certain point and then move on. I think at other times it's important to stay with pieces longer than you might even be comfortable, because you enter into another level of playing by staying with it. You get to a certain level of detail and polish. So there is, those kind of questions, I think, require judgment, and a good teacher will be able to help you make those calls because they have the benefit of perspective of the learning process and perhaps the validity of any particular piece. So you have to use your own common sense, you have to make your own choices, and acknowledging that not all pieces need to be learned to a certain level, but others can be. And so there's no black and white answer there for you, because it's not a black and white situation. All right. There's a lot of questions here. It's great. I feel like I sometimes get worried people might be bored. I suppose you can just log off if you're bored. I'm also starting to lose my voice a little bit. Oh yes, Stephen got a zone of proximal development. Thank you. I'm going to jump ahead to Carrie. Question. You mentioned that sometimes it is hard to stay with a piece for a prolonged period of time. How do we refresh our thinking to stay with it? Is there any different training we need to build in the mind? I think of repertoire sometimes like a person, in that, and I've used this analogy before, so I apologize, big fan of the analogies. Let's say you pass someone on the street and you see them. At that moment, you take that in, you make your judgments that are inevitably going to be made, and then you move on. You've seen that person, you have a very superficial, that would be maybe the equivalent of hearing a piece on I was going to say the radio, but I'm not sure how many people listen to the radio. Streaming on the YouTubes. That might be that equivalent. Sort of a nice overview, like you can say, oh, that looks like a nice person, and that, you know, or you be attracted to a piece or what have you. Then let's say that person ends up working where you work, and you get to know them, you know, but only in a work context. And then you end up going out to a work party, and you get to talk to that person, you understand them on a slightly more personal level. Then you end up becoming friends, and you meet their family, and they meet your family, and you have a decade of experience with them, and you know this person from all different situations and timelines and angles. And I think of music like that because you really start hearing it differently, learning. You hear people interpret it differently in concert. You hear it arranged as an orchestral piece. You know, one of my favorite experiences is when people are learning the Walton bagatelles. At a certain point, when they're learning, I'll say, "Did you know this has been orchestrated?" So William Walton, you know, worked with Julian Bream, who commissioned these bagatelles, the beautiful pieces, but he liked them so much that he orchestrated them. And it's a really interesting thing to hear people orchestrate guitar pieces, because suddenly the oral world has expanded to all these different instruments and textures and dynamics that are obviously not going to be on the guitar. And so that's kind of that's such a revelation of your experience with the piece. And then there's pieces that are arranged for guitar that were on other instruments, and we can hear, you know, I've heard recuerdos arranged for violin, but also you've got all the repertoire that we play from other instruments. So listening to harpsichord versions of BWV 995 or 998, or the violin iteration of the chaconne, Busoni's version of the chaconne, Brahms' chaconne of the left hand only. You know, that's going to start expanding your world of this piece and maybe bring more joy and more comprehension, more everything to it. So you do need to be a little bit creative, and I think, you know, even some people love history and understanding lives of the composer and the context of that. And you know, the world of Giuliani, if you go into the fact that he played cello in the 7th Symphony of Beethoven, maybe you want to think about the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, and then you think about the fact that he played with Paganini, and Paganini played with Legnani, and Paganini and they were all around Rossini, you know, like all of that kind of stuff interconnects and brings a richness to what we do. And that's part of the beauty of classical music, you know, of those periods, is there's a richness there, and then you've got literature that gets drawn into it and all sorts of things. And that can make it an enriching experience as well. And then, of course, the theoretical side of music, it's really, that's one of the great joys of it. I think some people sometimes approach that as potentially elitist, all these other aspects that tie into it. But I think all it is really just exploring a world. If you've got, you know, those movies that you do and that they're really well done as a period film, you know, it's all the details that come into it that make your enjoyment. And then if you know the place that they're doing it, it's incredible. So Mad Men, you know, based in New York in the 50s, it's so cool to see a really great depiction of New York in the 50s. Or Gangs of New York with Daniel Day-Lewis, set in New York but a different time. It's so cool to see that depiction of New York. And so then you have an appreciation of New York City in a different way than you would just go to the store. I'm getting pretty tangential here, but I think you get the idea. It's I think instead of, in general, don't necessarily beat down the door and to try and conquer a piece. If you're getting resistance and pushback from either yourself or the piece, see if you can maybe expand your world around that. And when you do come back to it, maybe it will feel and seem different. Okay, I might have to wrap this up. I think there's some great questions in here. Mark asked about my greatest joy as a teacher. I feel like I'd get emotional if I talk about that. So I'm not gonna bite on that one just yet today, Mark. Thank you, but I'm probably gonna wrap it up there. There's some great questions. Maybe save them for another time because they're really interesting. But I might have to wrap it up there. So thank you everyone for staying with me so long. Hope you enjoyed this. I'm still planning in lockdown Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. Same bat time, same bat channel. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'll do something. All right, everyone. take care, stay safe, and I'll see some of you Sunday at 4 for a happy hour. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.